The Biden administration recently announced $830 million in federal grants to fund 80 projects across the country. The money will be used to make our infrastructure more resilient to extreme weather and our changing climate. Joining me now to discuss this in more detail is Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Secretary Buttigieg, thank you for being with us today to talk about this and a few other things as well. Can you break down the 4 types of projects that this money will fund?
Yeah, this is about resilience in all of its forms. That includes things like evacuation routes for areas that are seeing more and more frequent and severe weather and hurricanes. It includes making sure that we have more seismic resilience, which isn't climate related, but is definitely something that affects our roads and bridges. It's about making sure that we get roads on higher ground when they've been washing out routinely, and we know there's going to be more where that came from. Fortifying our bridges. So many areas where we've got infrastructure that was built for what made sense in the 20th century, but it's got to be reimagined for the 21st. And for the first time in history, we're putting federal dollars specifically behind that mission of infrastructure resilience.
So let's talk a little bit more about that, because we had a record number of billion-dollar climate and weather disasters in 2023. And with climate change, fueling an increased number of extreme weather events, what would you say our weaknesses are right now in our infrastructure and that need the most attention right now?
Well, certainly sea level rise is an issue. So I was in Hawaii recently, the Honoapi'ilani Highway. This is the only connection between West Maui, where those wildfires took place, and the rest of the island. When they have high tides, what they call king tides, that actually swamps the road, and that's happening more and more often. We see examples of this everywhere from Hawaii to literally to Maine, so coast to coast. But you don't have to live in a coastal area to have these kinds of climate concerns. I think about my hometown where I grew up of South Bend, Indiana, a river city where we had 2 floods, each of which I was told was supposed to be a once every 500 year kind of thing. They happened within 2 years of each other. I-70 in Colorado, a key supply chain link, not a lot of alternatives as it goes among the mountains. And we count on the truck, even if you don't live anywhere near Colorado, you count on the trucking that goes through there. They had a double whammy of wildfires that then weakened the grip of the plants in the soil, that meant that when floods came after a drought, there were mudslides that made the entire highway inoperable. That's another example of where we can make investments that'll make an improvement. In Cincinnati, we're actually helping install sensors in hills that tend to slide when they have extreme rains. So, whether you're living on the coasts or the inland, whatever part of the country you're in, these things are affecting infrastructure, but we can do something about it. Design our infrastructure to better withstand these kinds of pressures that we know are continuing to come.
The Inflation Reduction Act set aside funding to build this national network of 500,000 public chargers by 2030. Now, according to the Associated Press, this is as of March 28th, only 7 stations have been installed, in 4 states. So what can you tell us about the status of this charging network and really what's to come with it?
That's right. Out of the 40 or 50 new programs created in our department by the Biden infrastructure package, this is probably the one that is the most new. We know how to fix bridges and build roads. We're just doing more of it under President Biden. But a national charging network is something that just wasn't even on people's minds when our infrastructure was originally built. We are now seeing the very first handful of chargers out of what will ultimately be thousands and thousands and then hundreds of thousands. The goal is to have that 500,000 that you mentioned by the end of this decade, because we can't go into the future of the automotive industry with yesterday's infrastructure. And we need to get to the point where, in the same way when you go out on a road trip, there's going to be a gas station between where you start and where you're going when you need it. We've got to have the same thing for charging stations. Now, charging is different from fueling. Lots of people will be able to do it at home and at work, but still, if you're on a long road trip or if you're in a situation where you got to get somewhere in a hurry, this can really be an issue. On the other hand, in disaster scenarios, we're also seeing the fact that many electric vehicles can double as a source of energy, like generators, and it really changes what's possible in terms of disaster response. right now, still a small minority of Americans have an EV, have one of those cars or trucks, but that share is growing every single year and is really going to change what it's like to respond to an emergency by 5 or 10 years from now.
And I want to talk more about that because a recent Pew Research poll asked Americans, are you likely to buy an EV car next? And, most of U.S. Americans are saying, well, not likely to consider buying an EV for their next car. What do you think is keeping so many people from buying those cars, and what's being done to address that?
Well, this is new, and our expectation is not that this is going to happen overnight. But we've also found that when people do buy an EV, they almost never say, oh, I want to go back to a gas car for my next vehicle. There are really two big things, two big obstacles we need to tear down to speed EV adoption. One of them is what we were just talking about, the chargers, which is why we're funding chargers across the country. The other is the price. The Inflation Reduction Act reduced the price that people face buying these EVs. The latest data I saw suggested there's still about a $2,000 gap. Now, you might make that back up because it is cheaper to charge a car with electricity than it is to fill it with gas, but that sticker price can be a barrier for a lot of Americans, and just the uncertainty, having it be new. Some people are opting for a plug-in hybrid. Actually, that's what our family does. We got a minivan. Never thought I'd be a van guy until we
You're a van guy
until
now,
we had
to
kids.
the kids.
It happens
it makes
to
it
you
easier.
quick. So for us, the first 30 or 40 miles, if we're going to Target, if we're going to drop them off at daycare, that's going to be electric. But if we go out on a road trip, then the gas engine kicks in. That's something that I think a lot of families, at least in this kind of in-between period where America's transitioning, I think a lot of families might find that's the right answer for them.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that one. It just seems so much easier. Do you think it's a better route to maybe go, okay, let's go in this middle ground instead of just pushing for full EVs?
Well, I think it really depends on the individual, and that's why we're not flipping some switch. We're not saying everybody's got to have an EV by this date or that date. Our goal is that by the end of this decade, about half of Americans will be buying a new car that'll be an EV. But it's going to depend on your individual situation. We're all about creating more and better options for people, and importantly, making those options more affordable. By the way, not just having the right kind of vehicle, but not having to have a vehicle or not having to use a vehicle every time. That's why we're trying to make sure there are better transit options as well.
Infrastructure has historically played a role in creating marginalized communities and making them more prone to things like flooding, poor air quality, for example. How are you going to make sure that the future of transportation in America is equal for all?
Yeah, this has really been an issue, especially when it comes to the infrastructure we've inherited. The way that freeways, highways, interstates, railroads were built often dismantled neighborhoods, cut them in two. This is another area where, for the first time in history, we have federal funding dedicated to doing something about it. I'm very proud of this Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhoods program. We're doing grants across the country. I was in Birmingham, Alabama, where the construction of the interstate there really impacted a historic neighborhood. We're helping them with a new vision for that neighborhood. Right here in Atlanta, a project called The Stitch is going to deal with how 75 and 85 cut key neighborhoods in two. But this is not just something in the South. Buffalo, New York is one of the first projects we funded, the Kensington Expressway, cut off the east side. We're going to put a deck over the top of it so the cars can still go, but now there's going to be new land knitting them together. Saw a similar project in Dallas. Every part of the country has this problem, and so we're trying to bring solutions to every part of the country.
And a lot of them will be climate friendly as well, so we appreciate that too.
Absolutely.
Secretary Buttigieg, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Great to be with you.